You know the snow will slowly melt, but my love will never die.
Johnny Gosch. Early in the morning on Sunday, September 5, 1982, 12-year-old Johnny Gosch set out to deliver the morning newspaper. This was a regular part of the boy's routine. He would deliver the weekly papers in the afternoon, but the Sunday paper was due early in the morning. Unfortunately, this was no regular Sunday morning for Johnny. Sometime between 6 and 7 that morning, Johnny Gosch disappeared. Johnny had gone missing from 42nd Street and Marcourt Lane. To this day, Johnny Gosch is still considered a missing person, and it is believed that he had been abducted while on his paper route. It has been decades since Johnny went missing, but his cold case is considered open. Normally, Johnny would wake his father up, and they would do the early morning route together. His parents were concerned about him doing the route at such an early hour, when the streets were dark and empty. It felt safer to have Johnny's father go with him. The night before, Johnny had spoken to his father about how the other kids on their routes would do their routes alone, and they were all much younger than him. Johnny's parents told him that he wasn't given permission to do the paper route alone, and that he should wake his father in the morning as he always did. However, that morning, Johnny didn't wake him up. Instead, he only took his miniature dachshund, Gretchen. Johnny had started doing the route because he wanted some pocket money. He was in junior high school, and having a paper route seemed like a good idea, as many local kids made money that way. Johnny liked to save up his spending money from the paper route and go to the mall with his sister. He loved buying model rockets. He would often buy a single rose from the florist shop to give to his mother. Johnny David Gosch lived in West Des Moines, Iowa, with his family. He had 2 siblings, and his parents were John and Noreen Gosch. Noreen was a secretary, and John worked at an agricultural supply company. Johnny Gosch was born on November 12, 1969, in Des Moines, Iowa. He had been a happy kid, quiet and friendly. Up until the day he was kidnapped, Johnny's life had been perfectly ordinary. The Gosch family lived in a fairly quiet neighborhood, and it seemed like the threat of having strangers kidnap their children right off the residential street seemed like such a distant threat. There was a false sense of security that went with living in a middle-class neighborhood, that their children would be safe. But children go missing in all sorts of neighborhoods, rich or poor, and the Gosch family was about to have their whole life turned upside down. John and Noreen Gosch only discovered that their son was missing because their phone started ringing off the hook. Customers were complaining that they had not received their newspapers. At first, they were concerned that their son had simply overslept, so they went to his bedroom to check on him. But he wasn't in bed, and they found that the dog, Gretchen, was missing as well. Johnny often took Gretchen with him, so that wasn't unusual. Johnny's father started to travel along his son's paper route to find out what had happened to him. 2 blocks away from the family home, he found Johnny's wagon, which was still full of undelivered newspapers. He knew then that something was very wrong. His son was nowhere in sight. He quickly delivered the rest of the newspapers, then headed home. As soon as he got home, John told his wife what he had discovered. The dog came home on her own shortly after. The Gosches immediately called the Des Moines Police Department and told them that their young son was missing. They waited for 45 minutes for the police to arrive and take their statement. In the meantime, Noreen started calling the other paperboys who had picked up their papers in the same area as their son. Some of the other paperboys had seen Johnny that morning at the paper drop, picking up his copies of the Des Moines Register. One of the paperboys, named Mike, saw Johnny talking to a stocky man in a blue two-toned car parked near the paper drop. Another witness, John Rossi, had also seen the man in the blue car. Rossi had thought that it was strange. Johnny Gosch told Rossi that the man in the car had been asking for directions, and asked if Rossi could help him. The man in the car drove away, but then it had returned shortly after. Johnny had told the other boys that there was something weird about the guy in the car, and he was going to do his papers quickly, then head home. One of the boys had watched as a tall man walked towards Johnny to talk to him. The man had followed Johnny around the corner, and they were out of sight. Then, the boy heard a car door slam. A boy sleeping in his room nearby had heard this door slam as well, and had looked out the window to see a blue car speed away. Rossi had glanced at the car's license plate number at the time, but was later unable to recall what it was. He later went under hypnosis, and was able to remember a partial plate number. When the police checked the partial plate, they determined that it was a plate from Warren County, Iowa. When the police finally arrived at the Gosch residence that morning, and began taking the Gosch's statement, Noreen was able to tell them about all the information she'd collected from the witnesses. Paperboys who had seen her boy talking with unknown men, the description of the car, everything. Unfortunately, the police were not interested in what the parents had to say, and they were unconvinced that Johnny had been abducted. They informed Johnny's parents that the missing boy couldn't be classified as a missing person until 72 hours had passed. This delay was incredibly stressful for the Gosch family, and they were desperate for the police to begin the search immediately. The police initially believed that Johnny had simply run away. They asked Johnny's parents about the boy's home life, and if he had been unhappy for any reason. They were looking for something that would corroborate their theory that he was just another runaway kid. But he wasn't. A family friend worked with the parents to organize a local search, hoping to find Johnny. But there was no sign of Johnny, or his newspaper bag. Hundreds of volunteers had joined in the search, looking in parks, and vacant lots, wooded areas, and ditches. They searched the nearby state park located 5 miles away, and even the river. The search was difficult, because it had started to rain heavily after Johnny's disappearance. At one point during the search, Noreen Gosch had insisted that Police Chief Orville Cooney had stood on a park table and used his bullhorn to address the crowd of locals that were searching for Johnny. He told them that they needed to stop looking, because Johnny was just a runaway. Given the fact that Noreen Gosch and Orville Cooney had a poor relationship, Gosch's version of events should normally be taken with a grain of salt, as it was likely her skewed poor opinion of the police chief. She had gone after him several times, calling him an incompetent alcoholic, while at other times referring to the police chief as the town drunk. She had attended city council meetings, bringing her attorney with her, and things had quickly gotten heated. Orville Cooney seemed to have an equal amount of hatred towards Noreen. He said the following about Noreen Gosch: "I really don't give a damn what Noreen Gosch has to say. I really don't give a damn what she thinks. I'm interested in the boy, Johnny, and what we can do to find him. I'm kind of sick of her." But in this case, Noreen Gosch wasn't the only one that thought poorly of Orville Cooney. He didn't have a stellar reputation. At 17, Orville Cooney had been arrested in 1951. He had taken a teenage boy on a ride with some of his friends, and they'd severely beaten the teen. This had gotten him a 30-day jail sentence, after Orville had pleaded guilty to assault with intent to inflict great bodily injury. In 1982, the Des Moines Tribune had published a story about Orville Cooney. They had interviewed 18 employees from the West Des Moines Police Department, 14 of which were patrol officers. When they were asked about their personal experiences they had working with Orville Cooney, the employees spoke out about how the police chief had physically assaulted a handcuffed prisoner, and that he frequently threatened and harassed his own officers. They told the paper that there had been a burglary investigation that had been tainted, when one of Orville's sons had been implicated in the crime. And there had also been repeated stories of the police smelling alcohol on Orville's breath, and also seeing empty beer cans in the man's vehicle. There were also racism allegations, in which Orville had allegedly used the N-word, and had also loudly spoken out about he'd refused to ever hire women or black employees at the police station. When the article came out, the allegations made against Police Chief Orville Cooney was enough to begin an investigation into him. However, he faced zero repercussions for anything. Instead, the only ones who were punished were the whistleblowers who had come forward. Many of the cops were reprimanded for coming forward, and 2 of the officers were fired outright. The reason given for them being fired was misconduct that had taken place months before. There was some backlash from these officers being fired, and the paper published scathing letters regarding the issue. Orville Cooney was able to get through the investigation without getting punished for his abhorrent behavior, and he also managed to keep his job. The Gosch family struggled deeply with losing their son. Both parents were grieving, and it was hard to go on without him. But they knew that they had to keep fighting for Johnny, to try and find him, and get answers. The police were still convinced that their son was a runaway, and they were doing little to try and find Johnny. There had been no ransom, and no motive that they could determine. When the Gosch family tried to work with the police regarding their son, the police were still insisting that Johnny Gosch had simply run away from home. They seemed stuck on this idea, no matter what Johnny's parents said. The Ghosh family contacted the FBI in hopes that they would investigate. But the FBI told them that they weren't going to be very involved in the case at all. So, the Ghoshes started handing out photos of their son to the media. They had 10,000 posters printed off, which were sent to bus stations, gas stations, police, coroners, the media, anyone they thought might be able to help out. Johnny's parents had also hired a sketch artist to draw the man witnesses had seen in the blue car. The Ghosh family believed that they were essentially doing everything possible in the investigation to bring home their son, believing that the police were still certain that he was a runaway. They were very vocal about their son's disappearance, and got a lot of Des Moines residents to help them in their quest. Some people helped them sell chocolate bars and other items in grocery store parking lots to raise money for private investigators, while others made shirts and hats with Johnny's face on it. Local residents cared, and they wanted to bring Johnny home. It was disheartening to think that the young boy was missing, and many parents feared for their own children's safety. Parents kept a closer eye on their kids, and some even started making their children walk in front of them at all times while in public, as they feared that someone could run up and snatch their children away behind their backs. John and Noreen Ghosh kept in contact with people at different newspapers. They also spoke to people, and made appearances on TV shows to speak about their son. Not everyone had her back. Some saw her as a grieving mother, while others saw her as a crazy woman who was hysterical. Her public image was tarnished, because Noreen spoke openly about her disdain for the police, critical of how unhelpful they were. Noreen Ghosh kept going over everything in her memory, trying to figure out what had happened to her son. She felt like she must have missed something. One memory that came to mind was an incident that took place 2 days before Johnny's disappearance. The family had gone to Valley High School to watch their son's JV football game. Johnny went to the concession to buy popcorn. He didn't come back straight away, so his father went to check on him. He found his son under the bleachers, talking to a cop. Johnny's parents were curious about the conversation between Johnny and the police officer, and they asked him about it. Johnny didn't seem upset by the interaction, and he said that the cop was being nice to him. But his parents were concerned. It seemed strange that the cop would pull their son away from the crowd and speak to him privately under the dark bleachers. When they asked Johnny why he'd willing gone with the cop, he'd simply explained that he'd talked to him because people were supposed to do what the police said. Johnny had pointed out the police officer to his parents when they were preparing to leave the football game. Noreen made sure to get a good look at his face. Later, once her son was kidnapped, Noreen recalled this incident. She wanted to try and talk to the police officer to find out what had happened between him and Johnny. Before she could talk to him, she'd first need to figure out who he was. Noreen made an appointment with the West Des Moines Police Department. Then, she contacted the school board and asked for a list of all the cops who were hired to work security at her son's football game. She brought this list to the police station when she met with Orville Cooney. During the meeting, there were photos of all the police officers laid out on the table, and Noreen Ghosh was able to study them. Unfortunately, she couldn't identify the man she'd seen at the football game in any of the photos. Noreen suggested that there might be some missing photos. Someone eventually got up and returned with a few more photos. It was then that Noreen recognized the man who had talked to Johnny at the football game. They were able to do a process of elimination, and eventually whittle down the list of cops who'd worked security, until Noreen could determine who had spoken to her son. Noreen wanted answers. When the school board had given her the list of police officers, she'd given a copy to the police chief, and kept a copy for herself. Noreen Ghosh tried to ask if she could speak to the officer who'd been at the football game, to understand more about his conversation with Johnny. Unfortunately, Police Chief Orville Cooney was deeply angered by her suggestion. He threw a fit, shouting and stomping his feet. Orville insisted that Noreen was not allowed to talk to the officer. This led to Noreen thinking that he might be trying to hide something. The police officer was questioned later on, and it appeared that his conversation with Johnny Ghosh had been unrelated to his abduction. As the police began their investigation, they eventually changed their minds and determined that Johnny Ghosh had actually been kidnapped. It was estimated that Johnny Ghosh had been abducted about 12 minutes after he'd left home that morning. Throughout the investigation, the police were unable to find any suspects in the case, and nobody was ever arrested for the boy's disappearance. In the month following Johnny's disappearance, There had been a great deal of sightings around the United States. A young teen boy had been spotted on a street corner in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He'd shouted out for help to a woman standing nearby, and told her that his name was John David Gosch. However, two men had quickly grabbed him and dragged him away. The woman had apparently not gone to the police right away, because she hadn't been aware of the Johnny Gosch abduction until months later. She saw his picture on TV, and recognized him as the boy she'd seen in Tulsa. Sightings of Gosch were reported in New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and others. Somebody had seen someone resembling Johnny, with a man that looked like the person in the sketch drawing the artist had done earlier. Each time a sighting was reported, the Gosch family were hopeful that it would be Johnny. But each time, they were disappointed to learn that it wasn't. They wanted it to be him so badly, but their optimism was slowly chipped away, until they learned to lower their expectations and presume each time that it wasn't Johnny. On November 12, 1982, the Gosch family celebrated Johnny's 13th birthday, in a big celebration. It should have been a big event for the boy, had he been safe at home. But he wasn't there to celebrate the big day. His family hoped desperately that they would get to reunite with him soon, but it had been months at that point, and he was still gone. After Gosch had disappeared, there were two cases of young paperboys who had gone missing. Danny Eberly and Christopher Paul Walden, from Omaha, Nebraska. 13-year-old Danny had gone missing on September 18, 1983, in Bellevue, Nebraska. His brother had seen Danny talking to a man in a tan-colored vehicle for days leading up to his disappearance. His bike and newspapers were found on his route, but Danny was gone. His body was found 3 days later on a gravel road, about 4 miles from his paper route. He had been bound and stabbed multiple times, and stripped down to his underwear. On December 2, 1983, 12-year-old Christopher Walden went missing in Papillion, Nebraska. He'd disappeared about 3 miles from where Danny's body had been found. Witnesses had seen a white man in a tan-colored vehicle. He was found 2 days later near the train tracks. He'd been stripped to his underwear and stabbed, though he hadn't been bound. Because of the fact that they were young boys around Johnny Gosch's age, and they were paperboys who had been seen talking to strange men in vehicles. Could these two boys be somehow related to the Johnny Gosch disappearance? In January 1984, the police discovered that the man who had killed both boys was a radar technician from Offutt Air Force Base named John Joubert. He had a history of stabbing and torturing people since his youth, and was extremely sadistic. He had murdered a young boy in Maine, and had slashed multiple victims over the years. The FBI were able to finally track Joubert down and arrest him. Joubert confessed to the murders and was sentenced to death. He was sent to the electric chair on July 17, 1996. Although at first people were quick to point out the similarities with the news stories of more paperboys who had gone missing, there didn't seem to be a connection between the boys in Omaha and Johnny Gosch. But Noreen Gosch and others were insistent that these cases were all connected. They were paperboys of a similar appearance and age, and that was enough for Noreen Gosch. Over the years, Johnny's mother would continue to search for anything that might be connected to her son's disappearance. She had at one point realized that a few months before Johnny went missing, the Gosch family had received pamphlets at their house from a religious organization called The Way International. Noreen insisted that because this religious cult had mailed pamphlets to her house, then they must have taken her son. She also stated that as soon as they had received the paperwork in the mail, her son had become withdrawn and argumentative. He had, apparently, become deviant because of the cult's mailed paperwork. The religious organization spoke out against her allegations, stating that what she was saying was ridiculous. Noreen Gosch was fond of throwing around the deviance angle around. During the 80s, she would publicly call out homosexuals for being responsible for her missing son. Noreen Gosch was insistent that gay people were predatory towards children, and they needed to be investigated, simply for their sexuality. This included blaming NAMBLA, the North American Man/Boy Love Association, who believed in advocating for pederast/pedophilia relationships between men and younger boys. NAMBLA had been investigated by the FBI and police over the years, though they had not been able to find evidence that the organization had kidnapped Johnny Gosch. Throughout the years, a lot of people tended to look at the paperboys' disappearances as the country's moral failing, as people kept talking over and over about the American dream and the loss of innocence. They were young, handsome white boys from middle-class families, from regular suburban neighborhoods. People kept describing Johnny as all-American, and talking about how children were expected to earn pocket money through paper routes. Having children going missing in such a way meant that parents were keeping a closer eye on their kids, and stating that their children's innocence was getting ripped away. Parents started walking their kids to the school bus, or taking away their paper routes, keeping closer tabs on their children, and teaching them that they needed to be fearful of strange men in strange vehicles lest they end up like poor Johnny Gosch. The missing paperboy became a cautionary tale, spoken about in hushed tones to younger children, parents fearful that their child might be next. Neighborhood watch programs became extremely popular at this time, as parents were scared of letting their kids wander too far from home, and were determined to have everyone look out for children in the area. There were other programs cropping up, such as Stranger Danger and Operation Kids, which tried to teach children about safety tips and talks with local police officers. Locals in Des Moines were also encouraged to keep their porch lights on for the paperboys and girls, to keep them safer. In September 1984, the Anderson Erickson Dairy decided that they would put the pictures of Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin on their milk cartons. The dairy company was from Des Moines, and they hoped that this would bring more awareness to the two missing boys, as people would see their photos every day while they drank milk. In December 1984, the non-profit program National Child Safety Council began the program called Missing Children Milk Carton Program, in hopes that someone might recognize the children and help solve the disappearances. This led to milk cartons across the United States to feature missing children photos. 3 months after it began, about half of the independent dairy companies had begun displaying photos of missing children such as Aiden Patz, Johnny Gosch, Eugene Martin, and others. This practice of milk carton kids continued on during the 80s, though it was later replaced with the Amber Alert system in 1996. The idea of putting the kids on milk cartons seemed to be good in theory, as so many people would see the children's faces and hopefully report to the authorities if they spotted the missing child. But it was also criticized for creating a lot of stress and anxiety in young children, as they stared at the photos during breakfast every morning. There was also the fact that white children were predominantly chosen to be on the cartons, while black or brown children were not represented as much. Many of the milk carton children were never found. There were a few cases where the children featured on the milk cartons were found dead. Children like 16-year-old Molly Bish, who had disappeared in 2000, while lifeguarding in Massachusetts. Her remains were found 3 years after she'd disappeared, located 5 miles from where she'd been abducted. Children like 6-year-old Aiden Patz, who had gone missing in New York while walking to his bus stop, and children like Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin were never found. The Gosch family had been determined to find out what happened to their son. They wanted him returned safe and sound, but the authorities had not been able to locate him. Noreen vowed to keep her son's bedroom exactly the way it had been since her son's disappearance. She was determined to keep the porch light on, as a beacon for Johnny Gosch to come home. She held on to hope, believing that he was alive. Noreen Gosch had been vocal over the years about her disappointment with the police department's failure to bring her son home. She was critical about their investigation into not only her own missing son, but also the investigation into a great deal of other missing children throughout the years. Kids would go missing, and the authorities, who should have been thoroughly investigating, just didn't seem to care enough about the missing children to actually look for them. In 1982, Noreen Gosch created the Johnny Gosch Foundation, where she would speak out at various seminars and visit schools about sexual predators, in hopes of bringing awareness to the subject. Parents had become fearful that their child might be taken as well, and they started to keep a closer eye on their children. Noreen Gosch lobbied for a new bill, titled the Johnny Gosch Bill, which would make sure that the police would immediately start searching for missing children, instead of waiting hours or days that could be crucial. In 1984, the bill became law in the state of Iowa. Over the next few years, other states, including Missouri, introduced similar laws. Retired Des Moines Police Chief William Mulder spoke out about the new bill, and about how instrumental Noreen Gosch was in creating change in the speed in which the authorities reacted to missing persons cases. He said the following: "The idea was that most kids come home on their own. But Noreen Gosch woke us up. That wasn't good enough. If a kid is hanging out at a friend's house for a couple of days because he's pissed off at his parents, we should find that out. We should know. Noreen Gosh did what any mother should do, what any mother has to do in her situation. She kept hope alive. In August 1984, Noreen Gosh testified about organized crime and organized pedophilia during a series of Senate hearings. She stated that it was her belief that rich pedophiles had organized kidnapping rings around the United States, who would kidnap young children to use as sex slaves. And it was her firm belief that her son had been kidnapped by someone involved in this ring. She was also invited to the White House for Ronald Reagan's dedication ceremony. Because of her testimony, Gosh started to get death threats. This would not deter Gosh's quest for change and justice in missing persons cases. The Gosh family had received a great deal of crank calls over the years, and had people contacting them with false stories or scams about their son and his whereabouts. The police had been able to trace some of the phone calls and found that they had been made by locals. Because the Goshes were so vocal about change, it made them targets for people who had poor intentions towards them. Noreen Gosh went on to testify before the U.S. Department of Justice, who would give $10 million to the newly created NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. NCMEC worked alongside the Department of Justice to help find missing children all over the U.S. They have thousands of cases today, which they are still trying to assist in locating. John and Noreen Gosh hired a private investigator to try and locate Johnny. The Goshes were desperate to get Johnny back by any means necessary. And in Noreen's case, this meant working 3 jobs to pay for the private investigators. Friends and neighbors had helped out the Goshes, holding fundraisers and selling candy. They had managed to raise about $200,000 in total to aid with the high costs associated with finding answers. Noreen Gosh believed that they would be able to dig up enough information that she could hopefully get her son back. She refused to give up. The PI had done some digging and determined that Johnny had walked a block north to where his route began. One of the paperboys had witnessed a man following Johnny. The private investigator had talked to the neighbors, and one of them said that they'd heard a door slam. When they'd looked outside, the neighbor had seen a silver Ford Fairmont speed in the opposite direction of where Johnny's wagon was later found. Over the years, the Gosh family had hired multiple private investigators to find their son. One of them had been Ted Gunderson, a retired chief of the Los Angeles FBI branch, and Jim Rothstein, a retired New York City police detective. One of the private investigators that had worked with Noreen Gosh was a former Vietnam vet named Sam Soda. In 1984, he had inserted himself into the investigation as he approached Noreen Gosh, offering to help her with her son's case. At one point, Sam Soda had called her into his office and told Noreen that there would be another Des Moines boy kidnapped. He specified that this boy would be taken on the second weekend in August, in Southside Des Moines. This turned out to be true. The boy taken from that location was young Eugene Martin. He is still missing to this day. In 1984, Sam Soda had passed himself off as a law enforcement officer. He exposed Frank Sikora, an employee of the Des Moines Register, as a pedophile. Sikora's crimes were apparently not connected to the Johnny Gosh case, or any of the other missing youths from the area. But he wasn't the only pedophile that had worked at the newspaper during the 80s. 37-year-old Frank Sikora was charged with child molestation and third-degree sexual abuse. Sikora had been accused of fondling teen boys that would work on the paper route. He had told the young boys to sleep over at his house, as they would be delivering their papers early in the morning. Sikora had allowed himself to be videotaped by private investigator Sam Soda, because the man had told him that he was with the police. But this was a lie. After he'd had the 2-hour taped confession in his possession, Soda had turned it over to the police, and this was used as evidence to arrest the man. Sikora was fired from his circulation job at the Des Moines Register. He was brought into the police station, and a polygraph test was conducted. There was no evidence to suggest that Sikora had done anything to Johnny Gosh, or any of the other missing teens from the area. Sikora gave a list of his victims to the police, which totaled 14 boys in total. He pleaded guilty to the charges. Over time, Noreen Gosh started to become suspicious of Sam Soda. He seemed to know a great deal about her son's case. The police were also suspicious about Soda, and they started to keep tabs on him. As soon as they started monitoring Soda's movements, the Ghosh family became inundated with threats. Sam Sota was never arrested in the Johnny Ghosh case, though he stayed on the police radar for years. In June 1984, the Ghoshes got a phone call from a local man, who insisted that he had information about Johnny. Curiosity got the better of the Ghoshes, and they decided to meet with the man. However, they were unnerved to hear the man talk about their son's case, because he knew a great deal about it. A suspicious amount. They considered it odd enough that they told the police. Once they became aware of the situation, they started to keep tabs on the man. After their meeting, the family started to get prank calls. The prank calls went on for months. Most of the time, it was just heavy breathing, or hang-ups. People sometimes spoke on the other end. During one of the phone calls, the man had told Noreen to drop her personal investigation into Johnny's disappearance. 20 minutes later, a strange man showed up in their backyard. He started to throw rocks at their windows. The Ghoshes called the police, but the man was never identified. In August 1985, a Tulsa, Oklahoma man contacted Noreen and told her that he could provide her with pertinent information that would solve Johnny's case. She was given information about what plane to take, and what Tulsa hotel to meet him at. She passed the information on to the authorities. When the FBI checked it out, they determined that the man had actually made reservations for Noreen. The meeting sounded sketchy, so the FBI decided to send a female cop in Noreen's place. When they held their meeting, the man was arrested, and did time for fraud charges. Noreen felt like her personal safety was at risk. The police told her that it was a good idea to hold a press conference, and announce that they knew the identity of Johnny's kidnapper. Shortly after this took place, the man that had been harassing the Ghoshes abruptly left town. They believed that the man's sudden departure was an indication that he had been involved. The phone calls stopped, and for a while, things calmed down. He would later return to Des Moines, though he kept to himself. In 1985, Noreen Ghosh got a letter in the mail regarding her missing son. The letter had been written by 19-year-old Robert Herman Meyer from Saginaw, Michigan, although it was signed Samuel Forbes Dakota. He wrote about how he had been a guard in the motorcycle club, at the same time that Johnny Ghosh had gone missing in 1982. He told Noreen that Johnny had been kidnapped by the motorcycle club, as they were running a child slavery ring. He stated that Johnny Ghosh had been sold to a high-level drug dealer in Mexico City. Meyer asked the Ghoshes for $10,000, so that they could get their son back. He told them he'd leave further instructions in a phone booth miles away from the Ghosh residence. The note told them to drive alone, and leave the money at the drop-off site, at 1 o'clock in the morning. Noreen believed Meyer's story, and was determined to do anything to bring her son back. Noreen contacted the police, letting them know what was going on. But unfortunately, she was unable to follow the instructions because she hadn't had enough time. Meyer called her, and said the following: "You waited too long, lady. You won't get your kid back now." When Meyer asked for $100,000 in exchange for returning their son unharmed, she was eager to comply. Meyer was arrested in Buffalo by the FBI at the US-Canada border. He was charged with wire fraud. When Noreen found out that Meyer had been arrested, she was extremely angry with the FBI, and critical of their choice to press charges against him. She thought that Meyer's arrest would destroy any credibility from the Ghosh couple, from anyone that would accept a ransom offer to get Johnny back. In 1989, 21-year-old Paul A. Bonaxai confided in his lawyer, John DeCamp, that he had been kidnapped as a teenager and forced into sexual slavery. Bonaxai had charges of molestation against him, and he was an inmate at a Nebraska prison. He admitted to DeCamp that he had been forced to help kidnap Johnny Ghosh in 1982. He said that he'd worked with 3 other men who he identified as being named Emilio, Charlie, and Tony. He'd described the 3 men to his lawyer, and had positively identified Tony as being the man in the composite sketch that the police had distributed. The man who he identified as one of Johnny Ghosh's kidnappers was believed to have also kidnapped a young girl named Michaela Garecht in 1988. Bonaxai's lawyer believed that his client was being truthful, as Bonaxai provided details about the young boy that someone could only know if they had met Johnny in person. He said that Johnny Ghosh had told him about sometimes attending his mother's yoga classes, and how they would go to their favorite Mexican restaurant afterwards, called Chi-Chi's. And Bonaxai knew that Johnny had bought a dirt bike shortly before his abduction, which he had used to bike around on the empty lot beside his house. The private investigator that the Ghosh family had hired, Roy Stevens, began to look into Bonaksai's story. Noreen Ghosh had given him a photo of Sam Sodha, which they then used in a photo lineup. Once Bonaksai had studied the photos, he'd recognized Sam Sodha and had even recalled the man's name. Bonaksai told the private investigator that Sodha had been the local contact for the people who had helped arrange for local Des Moines teens to be abducted. There were hours of recorded interviews of Bonaksai talking about his past actions as a kidnapper. Noreen was given the chance to listen to the tapes. It had been nearly a decade since Johnny had gone missing, and she was desperate for any new leads in her son's case. Noreen Ghosh set up a meeting with Roy Stevens so she could listen to the tapes. She listened to Paul Bonaksai talk in detail about his abusive childhood. At 15, he had befriended a boy named Mike in an Omaha park, who went on to introduce Bonaksai to a man named Emilio. He created child porn. It was September 1982, and Paul Bonaksai was invited to tag along with Mike and Emilio as they took a trip to Iowa. The three of them stayed at a Des Moines hotel. At one point, another man had come in with a paper bag crammed full of photographs. He had picked out the photo of Johnny Ghosh, saying, "This is the one." Bonaksai said that Johnny had been chosen because they believed that his eye color and hair color made him more desirable and they'd earn more money. Bonaksai realized that he was now involved in Johnny Ghosh's kidnapping, and he tried to get out of it. But the group were determined to keep Bonaksai involved in their plot. Emilio took Bonaksai out for a drive so he could talk to him. He parked on the side of a dirt road and pulled a gun on Bonaksai. Emilio threatened him, saying that Bonaksai had to help them kidnap the Ghosh boy, or he would blow Bonaksai's brains out right there and then. That was all the convincing that Bonaksai needed. Emilio drove the terrified teen back to the hotel room, where they began to work on their kidnapping plot. They practiced repeatedly to make sure that everyone knew their part. The group would be using 3 vehicles, and there were 6 people in total. Mike would be sitting in the back seat with Paul Bonaksai, so that when the driver approached Johnny, the boy would see the 2 young teens in the car. The driver asked Johnny for directions, then he quickly drove around the block. Bonaksai was instructed to get out of the vehicle and talk to Johnny in an effort to gain his trust. The group believed that this ploy would work because Bonaksai wasn't very big and would be less threatening than the adults. Bonaksai was only 15, just a few years older than Johnny. His job also entailed luring Johnny close enough to the vehicle so that they could abduct him without attracting too much unwanted attention. Early the next morning, they put their plan into action. They drove to the area, and Bonaksai got out and approached Johnny Ghosh. One of the kidnappers, Tony, got out and grabbed Ghosh. They both held a chloroform rag over Johnny's mouth, knocking him out. Then, they put him in the car and drove away. Everything had gone smoothly, exactly as they'd practiced. Bonaksai continued to talk on tape about how they'd switched vehicles multiple times. The original car used in the kidnapping was driven out towards Chicago. The others drove with Johnny towards Omaha, then they later brought him to a house in Sioux City. The kidnappers locked up Mike, Johnny, and Bonaksai in a windowless room for the night, while they all went out drinking. In the morning, the 3 boys were forced to perform on camera, and the kidnappers said they were going to sell the video. Then, Bonaksai was driven back to Omaha. Bonaksai went on to say that he saw Johnny Ghosh a few months later. While on a trip to Colorado, he learned that Ghosh had been sold to a man known as the Colonel. Bonaksai discovered that the man's ranch house had a raised floor, and there was a small area underneath where the kids would be held in captivity if they misbehaved. When Noreen Ghosh later met with Paul Bonaksai, she was convinced that he was telling the truth. She went to the prison in Lincoln, Nebraska, with the private investigator. They were accompanied by a news crew from Des Moines. They filmed the meeting between Noreen and Bonaksai, and some of the footage was used for the news. It was also featured in the documentary about Johnny Ghosh. Bonaksai had not been informed about who was about to visit him that day, and so it came as a surprise to learn that Noreen was there to see him. He became distraught and apologetic about the past, and deeply upset. Noreen had spent weeks working through her emotions before the meeting with Bonaksai. She had a lot of anger and resentment for the man on the tape, who had confessed to helping kidnapping her son. She was trying to work on forgiveness, as she'd read in books about forgiveness being primarily for oneself. so that it wouldn't eat away at someone like acid. When she met with Bonaksai, she realized that he was not too far off from her own son. Noreen felt compassion towards the man. Bonaksai told her about Johnny's birthmark on his chest, which had been widely reported when Johnny had gone missing. But Bonaksai had gone on to tell her about the scar on Johnny's tongue, and the burn on his leg, both of which had not been released to the public. He also told Noreen that he knew Johnny would start stammering when he was upset. Although De Camp and Noreen Gosh both firmly believed that Bonaksai was telling the truth about what had happened years before, the authorities didn't believe his story. The police and the FBI both decided against interviewing him about the kidnapping and sex ring allegations, because they thought he wasn't a credible witness. Bonaksai's siblings spoke to the police and insisted that there was no way he could be involved, as he had been at home when Johnny Gosh had been kidnapped. In 1993, America's Most Wanted TV show asked Paul Bonaksai to take them to a house in Colorado and show them where he had seen Johnny Gosh. Bonaksai went with a camera crew and showed them. The producer Paul Sparrow spoke out in the movie who took Johnny about what he had personally seen. When inspecting the secret compartment under the floor, he had seen multiple children's initials carved into the wood. Weeks later, the Omaha World Herald wrote an article about the house and how the police had investigated. The article stated that the sheriff's investigators in Colorado had examined Bonaksai's claims about the house and don't have any substantiation that Gosh was ever held there or that any laws were violated. Noreen Gosh claimed to have received a visit from her missing son in March 1997. She had gotten a knock on her apartment door at 2:30 in the morning. According to her, Noreen had gone outside to see her son, Johnny. He was accompanied by an unknown man who didn't introduce himself the entire time they were there. Johnny was 27 at that point, and he proved his identity to Noreen by showing her a birthmark on his chest. He had been wearing jeans and a winter coat over his shirt. His hair had been down to his shoulders and dyed black. She recognized him as her son, and they hugged. During the visit, which had been about an hour and a half, Johnny would continuously glance over at the unknown man for permission to speak. Johnny told her that he'd escaped from his kidnappers, and that he had been victimized by a Des Moines pedophile ring that took kids like him around the city. He had been cast aside once he was considered too old, and he told her he was terrified for his life. He told his mother that he was living under a fake name, because he didn't feel safe enough to return home. Johnny refused to give her his address, so she couldn't contact him after that visit. He had been warned that Noreen would be killed if he had tried to contact her, and he had feared visiting her in case someone retaliated. Johnny had told her that he wouldn't ever feel safe until the people who'd done this to him were arrested. He asked for Noreen's help in getting justice. During their conversation, Johnny confirmed Paul Bonaksai's story, stating that after he'd been abducted, they had been locked up in a room together. Soon after, Johnny had been sold off to the Colonel and transported around the country. He said that he was used by many rich businessmen and politicians. Noreen and John Gosh had divorced in 1993. John Gosh stated publicly that because he was not present when the visit between mother and son took place, he was uncertain if it had actually happened. There has been some speculation as to whether it had actually happened, and some think that maybe it was someone pretending to be Johnny Gosh. Noreen's story about seeing her son years after his disappearance had led to a great deal of speculation and conspiracy theories. The police were unable to determine if Noreen's story was true or not, but Johnny Gosh is still considered a missing person. Paul Bonaksai, who had come forward in 1989 stating that he'd helped kidnap Gosh under duress, had stated in 2023 that he'd known about Johnny Gosh's 1997 visit with his mother. He also stated that Johnny had visited him multiple times. He said that he knew that Johnny Gosh was still in hiding. He also said that he knew Johnny and his partner were expecting a child. Noreen Gosh had written a book in 2000, titled, Why Johnny Can't Come Home. The book went in depth into her son's disappearance. She wrote about Johnny's visit in 1997, and also wrote about the findings of the various private investigators the Goshes had hired. In 2006, Noreen Gosh stated that she had found photos on her doorstep. There was a color photo of 3 young teen boys bound and gagged, held in captivity. There was a black and white photo of a boy with a mouth gag, his hands and feet tied up. The boy had a human brand on his shoulder. Noreen firmly believed that the boy in the photo was her son. There was another photo of a man, who was possibly deceased. He had something tied around his neck. Noreen believed that the man was one of the people who had molested her son. She later posted some of the photos she received on her website. 2 weeks after Noreen had received the anonymous photos, the Des Moines Police Department had received an anonymous letter. It said the following: "Gentlemen, someone has played a reprehensible joke on a grieving mother. The photo in question is not one of her son, but of 3 boys in Tampa, Florida about 1979 to 80, challenging each other to an escape contest. There was an investigation concerning that picture, made by the Hillsborough County, FL, Sheriff's Office. No charges were filed, and no wrongdoing was established. The lead detective on the case was named Zalva. This allegation should be easy enough to check out." 2 of the photos were determined to be from a child pornography website. The children in the photos were later identified to be children from Florida. When Nelson Zalva had been contacted, he had worked for the Hillsborough County, Florida Sheriff's Office in the 70s. He was able to corroborate the details in the anonymous letter. Zalva said that the letter was correct, as he had investigated the photograph back in the 70s. He stated that he had also investigated the black and white photo, which Noreen believed depicted her missing son, in either 78 or 79, well before Johnny Gosch had disappeared. Zalva stated that he had interviewed the 3 children in the photo. They had told him that nobody had been molesting them, or coercing them into doing anything sexual. He said that he could never prove that a crime had taken place, and so nothing had ever come of it. When Zalva looked at the photos, he confirmed that they were the same photos he had seen decades before. He was asked to show proof that these were the same photos, however, Zalva was unable to do so. Years later, in the 2014 documentary titled Who Took Johnny?, law enforcement confirmed that the 3 boys in the photo had been identified. The photo of the other boy was still unidentified, and Noreen Gosch continued to state that that was her missing son. Both of Johnny Gosch's parents were interviewed for the documentary. Noreen Gosch firmly believed that there were human traffickers all over the country, particularly in Des Moines. Over the past few decades, she had been aware of a great deal of other cases of kidnapped people. Some of them were returned safely home. People like J.C. Dugard, who had been held prisoner for 18 years. Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped for 9 months, before she was found. And there was the case of the 3 women, Gina De Jesus, Michelle Knight, and Amanda Berry, who had all been held captive for years before finally managing to regain their freedom. Stories like this keep the hope alive for some family members, who want their loved ones returned safely. But sadly, many missing or abducted people are never found alive, and their families never get closure. If you have any information about Johnny Gosch's disappearance or whereabouts, please call FBI Special Agent Gerald Ingrasano at 515-223-4278 or West Des Moines Police Department Detective Tom Boyd at 515. Eugene Martin. 13-year-old Eugene Wade Martin had been a paperboy in the south side of Des Moines, Iowa. While delivering his papers early in the morning of August 12, 1984, Eugene disappeared. He had been delivering papers on Southwest 12th Street and Highview Drive. It is believed that Eugene Martin had been abducted. He has never been seen since, and his disappearance is now considered a cold case. The last time he had been seen was between 5:30 to 6 a.m. Normally, Eugene would do the route with his older stepbrother, but he'd gone alone that morning, because his brother was at a sleepover. Eugene wanted to earn enough money for the state fair, which was coming up soon. He'd gone to the pickup spot, Southwest 14th and Highview Streets, at 5:15 a.m., and grabbed his bag of newspapers from the driver. He sat down and started to fold his papers. That morning, multiple witnesses had seen Eugene talking to a man that morning, in what appeared to be a regular, friendly conversation. The man, who has never been identified, was described as being in his 30s, and had been clean-cut. Eugene's family only discovered that he had gone missing because the Martin family got a call at 7:15 a.m. The route manager told them that a customer on his route had called, because she hadn't received her paper that morning. When the route manager had gone to the corner, he found Eugene's paper bag that had 10 folded papers inside. However, Eugene was nowhere in sight. The route manager had delivered the papers himself, then contacted the Martin family to speak with the paperboy's father. Upon hearing the news that his son had not completed his paper route, Eugene's father, Don Martin, became instantly worried and went out to look for his missing son. Unfortunately, he couldn't find Eugene. Don called the police at 8:40 a.m. to report him as a missing person. Eugene had disappeared in a similar fashion to paperboy Johnny Gosch 2 years prior. In 1986, there was a third boy named Mark Allen, who disappeared just before Easter Sunday. The media had dubbed these 3 missing boys the Paperboys. It was believed that these 3 boys had likely been connected, possibly kidnapped by the same people, although the police had never been able to positively identify a connection between the 3 missing paperboys. While the police had been slow to investigate the Johnny Gosch case 2 years before, the police had begun to immediately investigate Eugene's case. They started to organize local searches for Eugene, with teams of volunteers scouring the area. The police decided to call the FBI early on in the investigation, in hopes that involving them would help bring Eugene home safely. At first, the authorities believed that Eugene had left home because he'd had a fight with his family. However, that was quickly ruled out, and it was determined that his disappearance was actually foul play. Eugene Martin had been 5 foot tall, and weighed 110 pounds. He'd had a scar on his right knee, and his broken right wrist was in a cast. When he went missing, Eugene had been wearing a gray and white striped midriff t-shirt with red sleeves, jeans, and blue track sneakers. He'd had brown hair and brown eyes. The local newspapers posted notices about Eugene's disappearance, asking for anyone with information to come forward. They requested that the paperboys keep an eye out for Eugene, or for anything suspicious. The newspaper got the supervisors to start monitoring the paper routes. The Des Moines Register announced that they would give $5,000 reward for whoever could provide information on Eugene's location. Later on, this reward money was increased to $25,000. The police started to question witnesses, trying to learn as much as they could about the boy's disappearance. They talked to everyone on Eugene's paper route, as well as his supervisor, and the other paperboys. During these interviews, the police learned some new information. They were told about a green car that had been idling near 14th Street. It had been seen around 5 a.m. that morning. The driver had been a white male, with short, dark hair. He had been in his 20s or 30s. This had potentially been the same driver who had been following some young girls in the area. Another witness had seen Eugene Martin talking to a man at Southwest 12th Street and Highview Drive between 5 and 5:45 a.m. The witness had not been able to hear the conversation, but he'd said that it had appeared to be a friendly conversation. The unidentified man had been described as being in his 30s and was clean-cut. Other witnesses further corroborated this sighting, as they had seen the unknown man with Eugene. The police were able to track down the man in the green vehicle, and he was questioned about his potential involvement in the case. The man told them that he had been in the area because he was dropping off his wife for work. They checked out his alibi, and his story was confirmed to be true. They determined that the man in the green car had no connection to Eugene's disappearance, and he was officially ruled out. A few days after Eugene's disappearance, the FBI announced that they believed Eugene Martin been kidnapped. They stated that they were looking for a man who they believed was connected to the boy's disappearance. The man was described in the Nationwide Bulletin as being a loner, about 30 or 40 years old. He was 5'9", medium build, and his hair was shaved. This was the man that witnesses had seen talking to Eugene. Early that morning, Noreen Gosch, Johnny Gosch's mother, had been confronted a few months in advance, before Eugene's kidnapping. She was told by the private investigator that she'd hired, that the kidnapping would take place the second weekend in August 1984, and that it would be a paperboy from the south side of Des Moines. The man who had told her this information had been Sam Soda. He'd been a Vietnam vet, and had been working as a private investigator. In 1984, Soda had exposed a pedophile named Frank Sikora, who worked at the Des Moines Register. The man was fired from his job, and later pleaded guilty to the sexual abuse charges. However, the police were unable to determine any connection between Sikora and Eugene's, or Johnny Gosch's missing persons cases. The man had passed himself off as law enforcement at the time, and there were allegations that he had continually inserted himself into the investigation into the missing boys. Sam Soda had been a person of interest for years, but he was never charged with anything. He was potentially involved in Gosch's disappearance, and people had alleged that he was involved with a human trafficking sex ring based out of Des Moines. Eugene Martin was born on August 17, 1970, in Des Moines, Iowa. His parents were Donald and Janice Martin, and they had divorced not long after Eugene was born. He'd had 2 brothers, Rick and Don, and 4 step-siblings, Kim, Mike, Don, and David. Eugene had lived with his father and stepmother, Sue Martin. Eugene had loved playing video games and watching Saturday morning cartoons. He had loved fishing and football and skating. Eugene had been a quiet boy, who was often described as being shy and polite. He had only started his paper route a few months before he'd gone missing, as he'd wanted to make some pocket money. The immediate area around Eugene's home and the location of his paper route had been searched, but there had been no sign of the missing boy. The authorities decided to expand their search to a wider perimeter. There were 25 police officers, 16 FBI agents, as well as volunteers, family, and friends, who were all looking for him. They searched warehouses, parks, riverfronts, ditches, anywhere that they thought Eugene might be. Others handed out flyers and made posters to hang up around Des Moines. Soon, however, it became clear to the police that Eugene Martin was not in the city. They decided to expand the search once again, and this time, the authorities began focusing their attention on the rural area surrounding Des Moines, in hopes that they would find him. They included air searches, using a great deal of resources to find him. Yet again, they were not able to find him. There were a lot of theories surrounding Eugene Martin's disappearance. Had it been an isolated event, people would have likely presumed he'd run off, or that it was unconnected to any other crimes in the area. However, there was no denying that Eugene Martin's case had distinct similarities with Johnny Gosch's case, although Gosch's case had had a great deal more media coverage. They wouldn't be the only young children to mysteriously vanish in Des Moines around this time. In Johnny Gosch's case, there was a great deal of speculation to suggest that he had been abducted by a pedophile ring working in the city who would allegedly abduct children of a certain age and sell them at auctions to foreign buyers, which is a horrifying thought. Gosch was believed to have been trapped in this ring while he was of a certain age, and then discarded afterwards, though he feared returning home. There was speculation that Eugene had suffered a similar fate, having been kidnapped by the same sort of people, for nefarious reasons. Eugene had been just a few days shy of 14. His birthday was on August 17, and though the Martins had planned a big birthday party for Eugene, they decided to cancel the event. He was supposed to receive a brand new bicycle, which he could use on his paper route. Unfortunately, he was still missing. Eugene's family prayed that he would be found and brought safely home. That day, instead of celebrating the big day with Eugene, the Martins sat by the phone hoping desperately that it would ring with good news. The FBI had instructed that they wait by the phone, holding a vigil, as they hoped for good news. Eugene's father, Donald Martin, vowed that they wouldn't throw a party for him until Eugene came home. He also vowed that Eugene's career as a paperboy was over, because as soon as he came home, he would make sure that his son would never return to his paper route. Donald Martin, who worked as a maintenance man at an apartment complex, was given permission by his boss to stay home for as long as he needed, while they waited for their son to return home. A few days after Eugene went missing, someone had called in a potential sighting. They had seen a boy fitting Eugene's description near Ankeny. The police were eager to find him, so they traveled to Ankeny Industrial Park, armed with spotlights and a helicopter. They spent about 2 hours searching the area, determined to locate him. But around dawn, the police halted the search. The Martin family firmly believed that their son was still in Des Moines. The police had been quick to jump into action when Eugene disappeared. 2 years before, when Johnny Gosch had disappeared, the police were extremely reluctant to investigate when Gosch went missing, and it was believed that he was abducted. Johnny Gosch's family were told they had to wait 72 hours before anything could be done, and the young paperboy had been treated as a runaway, which only further hindered the investigation. Johnny's mother, Noreen Gosch, had worked tirelessly to make changes in Iowa to ensure that missing children's cases would be immediately investigated. Since that time, the police have begun their investigating sooner, in hopes of finding the missing children and potentially bringing them home. The Martins had a few theories about what had happened to their son. They knew that he would never have followed a stranger into danger. They suspected that someone might have stopped him and asked him for directions while he was delivering papers. This was believed to be the way that Johnny Gosch had been abducted 2 years prior, as witnesses had seen a man in a blue car asking for directions from Gosch right before he'd gone missing. Teams of local volunteers had been searching the area for days after Eugene went missing, in hopes of bringing him home. The police were searching rural areas, as well as Easter Lake. A total of $64,000 had been collected for reward money, in hopes that someone might come forward with pertinent information in Eugene Martin's case. In February 1986, 43-year-old Wilbur Julius Millhouse was arrested, and received 6 charges of third-degree sexual abuse against him. 2 15-year-old boys had come forward to the police that the man had sexually abused them. When they started to investigate, the police were able to trace a sexually explicit phone call that Millhouse had made to a 14-year-old boy. When the police searched Millhouse's house, they found a massive list totaling 2,200 names and phone numbers for young boys living in the area. The handwritten notes had been filled with notations written in the margins with additional information about the boys. Some of them had school yearbook photos, while there were also baseball rosters. Millhouse had worked at the Des Moines Register until 1983, when he'd suffered a heart attack. At that point, he'd quit and stayed home. Millhouse used to recruit new paperboys for the Roots, as a circulation manager. He'd confessed to the police that he'd compiled the list of names of boys from when he had worked at the newspaper. He'd told the police that he'd use various fake names, such as Scott or Phil, when he would call some of the boys and try to engage with them in sexual conversations. Millhouse had been using a gab line. This was a party phone line that Northwestern Bell would provide to teens in 1985. However, the service was shut down because people were upset that teens were allegedly using the gab line for sex and drugs. When Millhouse had his phone line, he had managed to rack up an extensive monthly phone bill going as high as $383. The police decided to write hundreds of letters, warning the parents in the area that their children may have had contact with a pedophile. There was no way of knowing if Millhouse had actually had contact with all of the 2,200 boys, but they wanted to make sure that the families were made aware of the situation. It was better to be safe than sorry, so that the parents could sit with their children and talk about what had happened. By notifying the families, it meant that potential victims could come forward to the authorities. And over time, there were other boys who came forward telling the police that they had been confronted by Millhouse on various occasions. A former paperboy from the Des Moines Register came forward years later to talk about what he'd experienced in the 80s. Online, he went by the pseudonym Yellow Bag or YB. He stated that he'd been followed around in 1982 by a man in a Ford Fairmont asking for directions. When Yellow Bag had moved to a different part of Des Moines, his new circulation manager had been Wilbur Millhouse. At one point, Yellow Bag had seen Millhouse talking to a man. He'd recognized him as the driver of the Ford Fairmont vehicle that had asked him for directions in 1982. He believed that the man in the vehicle had been a pedophile, using the ruse to talk to young boys on their routes. He'd said that Millhouse had tried to proposition him multiple times. Yellow Bag had even said that Millhouse told him in conversation that he'd known Johnny Gosch, the paperboy who had been abducted on his route. And he'd said that Millhouse had said the following to him: nothing would have happened to Johnny if he would have just kept his mouth shut. Eugene's father, Donald Martin, died in 2010. He never got to reunite with his missing son, or find out what had happened to young Eugene decades before. The strain of dealing with Eugene's disappearance had been taxing on his father and stepmother's relationship, and they divorced not long after Eugene disappeared. Eugene's older brother, Donald Delica, was interviewed in 2023 by KCCI Des Moines. He stated that when they were younger, they would both ride their bikes around the neighborhood and spend hours outside. Donald Delica stated that he wished he could one day find out what had happened to Eugene. He urged anyone that knew information in his brother's case to come forward. Eugene's sister, Kim Delica, had also been interviewed about her missing brother. During a 2022 interview with KCCI, she stated the following: "My mom and dad never gave up on him. So as long as they thought he was still out there, I assume the same thing. Anyone with information about Eugene Martin is asked to call Det. Jeff Shannon at the Des Moines Police Department at 515-283-4864. You may also call Det Larry Penland at 515-237-1550. Mark Allen. On March 29, 1986, 13-year-old Mark James Warren Allen had been at home with his family. They lived on Southwest Emma Avenue, in Des Moines, Iowa. It was the day before Easter, and Mark's siblings were eagerly getting ready for a pizza and movie night. Mark asked his mother if he could head out to his friend's house just down the road. When she agreed, Mark rushed out to visit his friend. The last thing that Mark had told his mother was a hurried, "Save me some pizza, Mom. I'll be hungry when I get home." Then, he had rushed down the sidewalk, and after waving at his mother, Mark was out of sight past the nearby bushes. He was only supposed to be gone a short while, so at first, his family wasn't too concerned with his absence. Unfortunately, Mark never made it to his friend's house. He hasn't been seen since, and Mark Allen is still considered a missing person. Mark wasn't reported as a missing person straight away. His mother noticed on Easter Sunday that her son was not at the house. She thought that maybe he had just gone to his grandma's house, because she would always hand out Easter baskets for each of her grandchildren. But when Nancy called her mother, she was told that Mark wasn't there. Nancy started calling up Mark's friends, asking if anyone had seen her son, but nobody knew where he was. It was then that she called the police. She was informed that they wouldn't do anything for the first 48 hours. When the 2 days were up, the police contacted Mark's father in Minnesota, and also reached out to the boy's grandmother in Connecticut. Neither relative knew where Mark was. When Mark first went missing, a lot of people thought about some of the other teen boys who had gone missing in Des Moines around that time. 12-year-old Johnny Gosch had disappeared on September 5, 1982, and 13-year-old Eugene Martin disappeared on August 12, 1984. They had both been working on their paper routes, and had disappeared under similar circumstances. It was believed that they had both been abducted, possibly by the same kidnappers. They had never been seen since. And there was a great deal of other missing children from the area. Nancy Allen didn't know if the same person had taken Mark, or if there was any connection to her missing son. But she hoped that the police would investigate thoroughly, and find out what had happened to Mark. Unfortunately, the police were not keen on putting too much effort into looking for him. Nancy Allen said the following: "I just feel like, at this time, they were just afraid of what would happen with the Eugene Martin and Johnny Gosch thing. I got the distinct feeling that they did not want parents to be frightened to let their children sell newspapers or do different things." Although Nancy was convinced that the police were needed to put in a great deal more effort in finding Mark, there were some members of the Des Moines Police Department who had spoken out in media interviews to say they had worked diligently to bring the missing boy home. Sergeant Jeff Edwards conducted a 2010 interview with Who TV, stating the following: "I know detectives followed up on leads that did not pan out. They were not able to locate him. He's still listed as a missing person." Mark James Warren Allen was born on May 13, 1972. At the time of his disappearance in 1986, Mark weighed 85 pounds, and was 5 feet tall. He had brown hair, and blue eyes. The day he went missing, Mark had been wearing blue jean shorts, a light blue t-shirt, white socks, and gray sneakers with Velcro. He had a scar on the top of his head. Mark was described as being a handful by his mother, Nancy Allen. He had somewhat of an unstable childhood, as Mark was constantly being moved back and forth between his mother's Iowan home and his father's home in Minnesota. This went on for years. Mark had a reputation for getting into trouble. Mark Allen's mother, Nancy Allen, struggled to cope with the loss of her young son. She wanted desperately to get him back, but as the days and weeks went on, the hope of finding Mark started to dwindle. Over time, it felt less and less realistic that her son was going to come home. There was a great deal of fear that perhaps Mark Allen had been kidnapped by the same people who had taken Eugene Martin and Johnny Gosch. The two missing paperboys had their photos featured on milk cartons, in hopes that someone might recognize them and contact the authorities. There was a great deal of conspiracies and theories about what happened to the missing paperboys, but one of the main beliefs were that they had been trafficked by a local pedophile sex ring who were transporting the children back and forth across the country, to be bought and sold by rich people. Mark Allen might have been taken by these same people, and met the same disturbing, unfortunate fate. In November 2010, Nancy Allen conducted an interview with Aaron Brilbeck from Who TV Channel 13. She stated the following about her missing son: "It was hard because he had been living with his dad for a while, and then came back and lived with me. His younger brother and older sister were real close, and he wanted to be in there, in tight." Nancy Allen made a point of following news stories in Iowa. Every time she heard about a body being found in the area, Nancy would go through a series of mixed emotions. She wanted to know if the body belonged to her missing son. It was important for her to get closure in the event that her son had been found dead. But it was always extremely painful, because that would mean facing the fact that her son was well and truly dead. Nancy needed to lay him to rest. But as his body was never recovered, she was never able to properly lay Mark to rest. She would also never be able to find out what had happened to her young son all those years ago. For a long time, Mark's disappearance was believed to be connected to the other missing boys, as they believed he was another missing paper boy. However, on August 18, 2013, the Des Moines Register published an article stating that Mark Allen had not actually been a paper boy in Des Moines. He may still be connected to the other missing boys in the area, but he was not the third paper boy, as some believed he'd been. Johnny, Eugene, and Mark are all still missing persons, and their cases are unsolved. Mark Allen's dental records and DNA samples were submitted to various databases. However, they have yet to yield any results. If you have any information concerning Mark Allen's disappearance, please contact Abby Gayampolo at the Des Moines Police Department at 515-237-1430.
Yeah. Everybody knows that I'm breaking down. Everybody knows I ain't faking now. Everybody knows my heart's vacant now. Yeah, she hates me now, I made mistakes but now I don't ever wanna be alone. I don't really ever feel at home. On my own, in the zone, that's the only way I know. Feeling low, about to blow back up. Here I won't ever let the doubt creep in. Gotta pop a couple more aspirin. I don't think I'll ever let you in. Easier to break it off best friends. I don't really understand myself. I don't really understand, need help. I don't wanna be left on the shelf. Couldn't even hear me if I yelled. It's so cold outside, I'm alone, I'm alright. It's so cold outside, I'm alone.